George Kilpatrick Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. The Martin Luther King Jr. holiday is approaching. His actual birthday, of course, is the 15th, but we celebrate this year on the 18th. And in doing so, many people, of course, are familiar with taking what Coretta Scott King used this holiday as a day on and not a day off. So many of us, of course, will volunteer and do all kinds of things to make the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. relevant to our lives, right? And how important is that right now is in terms of what we're seeing take place in this country in a few weeks. We will see on the 20th, a new president sworn in, despite all of the shenanigans that have been going on up to this point. And so we're really, and at the time of this conversation, perhaps even a new Senate. So what does all of that mean? Well, part of a legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that has not been explored as much as his work in the ending of nuclear warfare, right? And so here to help us with all of that and to really understand why we should even be concerned about that are my guests. We're joined now by Dr. Vincent Intondi. He's the author of African Americans Against the Bomb. He's a professor of history at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, part of the DMV, if you will. Also joining us is Jim Anderson. He is the current National Vice President for Peace Action and the current president of the New York State Peace Action. And we're also joined by Diane. She is the chair of the Nuclear Free World Committee of the Syracuse Peace Council. So Vince, if I can call you that, why should, first of all, so when I was asked to put this together, right, I said yes, but I was like, but why? And what's the connection to King? And that's how it was pitched to me. So let me start with, I didn't even have any idea that I should even be thinking about this. Vince, so help us out.
Thank you. Thanks, George, for having me on. It's special to be here, especially somebody that grew up in Syracuse, New York on the north side and went to Henninger High School. So I bleed orange my whole life. And it's also special to be on a day where we're going to be talking about Dr. King and his larger legacy on this issue when we now have a pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Reverend Warnock, where Dr. Martin Luther King served and now is going to be a United States Senator. And when you think of John Lewis, you think of Julian Bond, you think of that, that rich legacy and history of Georgia and the Black Freedom Movement. It is an incredibly special day. Dr. King, and I'll first talk briefly about Dr. King and then in a larger sense of why this matters, if you will. My research focuses on the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. And I've certainly heard this question many times before. Dr. King, we like to, again, encapsulate kind of on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We box him in with I Have a Dream, and we largely ignored that last year of his life where he was the most radical in some senses, where he gave his April 4th, 1967 speech at Riverside Church, in which he came out against the Vietnam War and called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. But when it comes to, and that's when a lot of people think that he got into foreign policy issues, but on the nuclear issue, he actually was speaking about this as far back as 1957. In 1957, he made his first comments against nuclear weapons, saying they should be banned. And he consistently did that throughout his life, especially speaking to Black churches, Black colleges, activists, where he would combine, he saw that these issues were combined. He would say, what does it matter in integrating lunch counters and then not worried about the world in which we're trying to integrate? What does it matter if we achieve the social justice we're fighting so hard for if we're all dead from nuclear war as a result? And so in a sense, like today, here we are fighting to get out of a global pandemic that could, kill and has killed so many people. But what does it matter if we get a vaccine, we come out of it, could all be dead from nuclear war and then in the next minutes, right? And so he saw that, and he connected them more and more, even if you look at those triple evils he would talk about of militarism and racism and capitalism. And he learned a lot of this and fighting on this issue from his wife, Coretta Scott King, long seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. And so King was not alone. King came from a long line of Black activists from Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. I could go on of how many people in the Black community and rank and file individuals in the Black community, right? Nothing's a monolith. That made the connection that nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, the Black freedom struggle in the United States, and liberation movements around the world were inextricably linked. So why shouldn't you care? Why should the Black community care? Well, for starters, let's look at the economic conversion piece of this and economic justice, right?
Right, because that was the other piece of King's legacy, the idea of economic justice. Of course, the Poor People's March, Memphis, that's what that was all about, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So where I am in Maryland, not too far from me in Baltimore, the last couple of years, they have asked parents in Baltimore City schools to provide space heaters for their kids because there's no heat in these schools. And at the same time, we're set to spend over $1 trillion on new nuclear weapons when we have enough to blow up the world multiple times over. So showing the connections and where that money could go, because it's often taken from social programs and from the poor. When you look at nuclear testing, and who has been in terms of nuclear testing, it's always people of color in most cases, right? The Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Australian Aborigines, Native Americans, African American veterans who were used as guinea pigs in nuclear testing after World War II, Kazakhstan. When you look at where nuclear testing, where did the French test their first nuclear weapon in 1960? In the Sahara, and how that affected Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and what the fallout would do to the cocoa industry. We have seen more and more. So in the Black community, it's this connection with the rest of the non-white world, the rest of the global South, and how these things are interconnected. And that's where that colonialism piece comes in, right? And so what is it, again, if you're looking at why you care, even if you look at populations in urban areas and how many people live in a condensed area or city, if a bomb was to go off, who would be killed, right?
Right.
So, and so when the ultimate juxtaposition here is when you take that on one side, you have Donald Trump and you have Vladimir Putin, two white nationalist, white supremacist, dictatorial leaders who have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons in their hands. They could launch them anytime they want. And on the other side, you had over 120 nations, right? Mostly from the global South, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America that signed on, got it ratified, and now has a formal ban starting January 22nd on nuclear weapons in the United Nations. It can't be any clearer, the difference in the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. So there's a lot there that those connections are there. And this has been that way literally since 1945. African Americans, the Black Panther Party, Lorraine Hansberry have always put these two things together. And the Black church has been a huge part of that, from not just Dr. King, but the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry out of New York, and Riverside Church and Ebenezer and so on and so forth.
You know, as I listened to you, that was Vincent Intondi, author of African Americans Against the Bomb, along with Jim Anderson, National Vice President of Peace Action, and Diane Swords of Syracuse Peace Council. You know, as I hear, as we listen to that, what I kept thinking about is how you were framing this in the context of connecting this to Black liberation struggles. And what's interesting to me, Jim, as I'm listening to Vincent, is that oftentimes, though, people will say, yeah, but are we trying to just destroy all nuclear weapons all over the world? Or what are we trying to do here? Because what some might say is we need one to make sure that the other guy doesn't use it against us. So what are we really talking about here?
Well, that's a fallacy. I mean, one of the reasons that countries were trying to acquire nuclear weapons is that they thought it would be a deterrence. If I got one and you got one, we won't mess with each other, per se. But in the meantime, those who don't have it, since we have one, we bully other countries. The USA is full of plenty of history that in the so-called diplomacy and negotiations they do with foreign countries, it's not like they're going in there talking very kindly. They're going in countries threatening. And so not only that, that the conversation about deterrence, just an accident. If one of those weapons were to accidentally go off, the devastation is too great. Not only that, you don't have to look for the accident, look at the purposeful testing And Vincent mentioned in the Marshall Islands, women having jellyfish babies. And how can we be okay with that? Now, when it comes to communities of color, we need to go back to Riverside. And remember that when Dr. King spoke there, as you noted in the beginning, he was in the midst of organizing. In fact, they were still working on the plans for the Poor People's Campaign, which was going to start in 68. I remember it well. It was in 60, I'm in 67, 68. I'm right at that time. In fact, I'm a combat veteran of Vietnam. I went in because of Dr. King. That's another story. But what I want to tell you, when Dr. King spoke, remember the pushback he got? Not from the whites, from Black organizations that said civil rights and peace don't go together. It showed the ignorance of the time. It also was a time when there was racism. I mean, it may not have been roaring, but it was roaring enough. So there was a lot of lacking stuff there. We were still questionable about working across lines. Yet Dr. King was a multi-racial, diverse, all kinds of people was in the movement with him. So what it means for us now is that we have to go back and tell the story in our community. We know in the Black community, there's a romance around the military that helps to make them be blind to the fact that what are they doing? I'll end this little piece by saying this. As a combat vet, many people say, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
And I say, you know, why are you thanking me? Because if they knew what we were doing over there, they would either be mad at us or the people who sent us. The books of history is full of the negative things we're doing around the world that actually amount to war crime. But this whole piece around nuclear weapons, we have to get in this fight. We have skin in the game. A nuclear weapon anywhere is a threat to everybody.
Diane, I guess if I give up my arms first, but you're telling me that I've got a dictator over there like Putin or Kim Jong-un, folks that I cannot trust, why are you going to put me in a position to be? And I know all of y'all look like y'all want to get in on that, but Diane, you can start with that. All y'all are like, y'all are jumping into this thing. And Diane, I'll give that to you, but then, you know, Vincent, and then we'll talk about what you're really trying to help us all to see through the Treaty to Prevent Nuclear Warfare. But if I give up mine first, I can't trust these other guys. So help me walk through that.
Yeah, so it's not really about any one country giving them up first. That's why we have a treaty, right?
Okay, right.
The idea is to have everyone joining in together to work towards that. And the treaty basically starts with risk reduction. We're pulling back from a really, really dangerous position. And one of the things that that a lot of people in the US are pushing for is legislation for no first use. We don't have to be at the point where we've gotten rid of them all yet, although we're striving for that, to say we're not going to use them first. Okay. And that reduces the tension level. Additionally, another point of, and one of the things that I'm working on is something called the Back from the Brink campaign, and it has 5 steps, of which this treaty is one.
Right. So let's so we introduced the treaty. Let's talk about what that is: a treaty to prevent nuclear warfare, and then push through to the Back from the Brink campaign.
Yeah. Well, the treaty has a number of attributes that would cause countries to not deploy nuclear weapons on their soil, to not manufacture components for nuclear weapons.
Right.
Many countries already have pulled back from banking interests for nuclear weapons, and some corporations have said they will not take contracts, and banks have said they won't fund nuclear weapons, and that's all part of the treaty. And
I mispronounced it. It's a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Okay, so go ahead. Yes. I've been saying prevention, but all right.
Well, we're going to prevent nuclear war by prohibiting nuclear weapons. Good.
Right. So you're on the Peace Council's committee to for nuclear free world. So talk to me. So you said you have a back from the brink campaign, but before we get to that, Vince, did you want to add something? I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, as far as to take a step back, the idea that, well, we can't give them up first because then somebody else will still have them, etc. The first thing to remember is there's only one country in history that has used nuclear weapons, us, right? And so in one aspect, you go, who are we to say if anybody should have them, right? Who are we to tell anybody who or can't have them? And don't get it twisted, I don't want anybody to have them, right? But I mean, even when you look at the Middle East, there's only one country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons. It's Israel. No other country does, right? And so you don't have to unilaterally disarm. We're not naive in saying, okay, we'll just get rid of all of our nuclear weapons. Everybody has them. But you can say, look, we're going to take these steps to get down to 1,000, get down to 500. We are going to lead by example to say, look, with 500 nuclear weapons, we still have enough to kill millions of people, right? It's not. So you start that, and then offering those carrots and those sticks to other countries to join with us, and you can start that process of lowering instead of constantly going up, which makes no sense because, again, in something like Syracuse in particular, I remember a couple of years ago giving a talk at Barnes & Noble in Syracuse, and I had a lot of folks there that actually said to me, we're right, you're right, we're not in favor of nuclear weapons, but the main employer in my city is Lockheed Martin, that's where I work. Mm-hmm. It's a job for me. I don't care about nuclear, it's just a job. And so you run into that as well, that it becomes a jobs program where you're creating these weapons, and when is it enough? And how much money are you spending? So that's one thing to keep, in mind. And then in the TPNW, understand that it came from, people said it could never be done, that you could get a formal ban on nuclear weapons through the United Nations. And it was, again, largely done. It wasn't the main nuclear powers that were for it. It was the global South that pushed this and organized and got this done.
But we haven't signed it yet.
No, we haven't signed it yet.
It's not signed it. The United States, in fact, not only boycotted it, but pushed other countries and allies to not go along with it, which was appalling, right? But some things we have to realize going forward, there's this idea that if the nuclear powers, the big countries, the Security Council doesn't back it, it has no teeth. But that doesn't hold up anymore. Because even if you look at the veto power of the Security Council in recent times, it hasn't held up. Mm-hmm. If you look at even how the world and the economies are changing, look at Nigeria. And it's not going to be long when Nigeria's economy is just going to explode. And when you look at the power in terms of economics of other countries, so that those dynamics the world dynamics are changing. And it's not just that we're saying to these countries that sign on, ratify it, and then it goes into force that they will not use nuclear weapons. But as Diane said, it's not the production, it's you're not investing, it's no money. You're not allowing countries like the US to transport these materials or set up bases in your country if you go along with this. So there's other ramifications. And so there's a couple of things. One, it will hopefully shame countries like we did with chemical weapons, right? And how we look at them, right? That's number one. You also look at the landmine treaty. At one point, landmines were a norm, but they're not anymore. Millions of landmines were destroyed because of the landmine treaty and other countries getting involved. And when we say things like apartheid and institutional racism or nuclear weapons, and these things can never be changed, never be wiped out in our society, well, I say, look at South Africa. South Africa dismantled their entire nuclear weapons program right before Mandela got in power, and they got rid of apartheid. And not perfect, but it is an example that it can be done.
In your list, you can say, and could you think of possibly electing 2 Democratic senators from Georgia? But that's a whole other. Right. the idea of that would just be crazy. But Diane, what's the back from the brink campaign? And Jim, I'm coming back to you to talk about peace action. But go ahead, Diane. What's the back from the brink campaign?
Well, I just want to put it in the context of some people might say, okay, there's this great treaty and we're really happy about it, but we don't have, it's an international treaty. We feel that, it's really important. We want to support it, but what can we do? So the Back from the Brink campaign is steps that are actually achievable and that can be addressed by local people. In fact, it builds from a local level up to a federal and international level. So we are, first of all, locally calling on organizations within the community to endorse the project, which calls for these 5 steps, and which is no first use, taking the authority away from presidents to have the sole authority to launch, which many people don't realize that is the president's prerogative.
He has the codes. He has the codes.
He has the football. Yeah. Taking the weapons off hair trigger alert, cutting way back on the money that's supposed to be spent to revamp the whole nuclear arsenal, and an international treaty. So there are these 5 things, and there is legislation that we can address. So when we're asking local organizations then and individuals to endorse this campaign, we are building the public backing for the campaign. And then we start asking our legislators to back it. And already the mayor of Syracuse and the Common Council have endorsed the Back from the Brink campaign. So they see, especially they were very focused on the economic impact, but certainly they're in charge of protecting the city, and you can't protect a city when you're risking nuclear war. And then we work up to our senators and work on getting them to support ratification of the treaty, as well as the 4 other steps.
So Jim, just hearing that, and so working it up the chain, Peace Action. Tell me about Peace Action, and again, why Black folk in particular should be on board with this, because you made a plea earlier that we needed to get on board.
Well, because we got skin in the game. Look, if we're not on the side of helping to not only reduce and eventually rid the world of nuclear weapons, we're just waiting around for something terrible to happen. We certainly don't have a reason to argue that we're using it in self-defense. And the big part is that there's a great deal of ignorance in our community on this issue. Many people think they shouldn't even be thinking on this, that this is over their head. That's part of the legacy of racism. I know, because I've been pushing this for more than 10 years, actually before then, but I've been pushing and trying to connect the dots. This moment is very fertile and a necessary moment, because we're in an intersectional moment. And what we're seeing, all of these issues that connect. We talk about what nuclear weapon is doing around the world to people and planet. And when we talk about not only that, when we talk about that economics again, the money that is investing in these defense companies to create these terrible weapons and much more are the ones who are taking money that the people need. And the question is, when are we going to go after it? The social justice movement moves with a tagline of stop runaway inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, about getting their money back. Well, when you look at the discretionary budget and see how much money the Pentagon is getting and how little the human needs area is getting, who's getting robbed? And why? We're not going to go after it. And I'll end by saying this. You know, since you mentioned Georgia and the possibility of the Dems taking the Senate now, we still going to have to push, because Senator Schumer is not necessarily a champion on these peace issues.
Oh.
And it's the classic case that we have with the neoliberals who got the soundbite, but no action. If we want to see change, if we want to see monies coming back to our communities, not just COVID, which is what Schumer talked about, how come he wasn't a lion and strong on the 10% cut to the Pentagon budget, which would have brought even more money? I'll stop there.
Well, listen, we're out of time. Vince, you wanted to say.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is, when we think of Syracuse, we think of Buffalo, we think of Rochester, we think of Central New York, Western New York. This was historically a hotbed for the abolitionist movement.
Yeah.
These are cities where John Brown and Frederick Douglass, Garrett Smith and others met to plan these fights, to plan with the Underground Railroad and to help in Black freedom. You look at the connection, you look at that history, along with the history of Native Americans and what Native Americans have been through with nuclear testing and the relationship in Central New York. You look at the 9 Mile nuclear power plant. You look at Lockheed Martin in your backyard making nuclear weapons, right? You look at all of this together and say, in some respects, where you guys are located should be the epicenter for nuclear disarmament and fighting for this.
I agree with you. So Diane, how do people get involved?
Okay, I just would urge people to look at the Syracuse Peace Council website and the Peace Action website, both Peace Action National, Peace Action New York State.
Okay, and so Peace Action New York State, and the Syracuse Peace Council, and that
Facebook pages.
Facebook pages, and this is how we can get involved. And I know there's a whole lot more on this issue. I think we just touched the surface, but bottom line is, you want communities to be involved and become aware of this issue, and supporting the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I want to thank my guest, Diane Swords, who's the committee chair for the Committee for a Nuclear Free World. She's the chair of that committee for the Syracuse Peace Council. Jim Anderson is the vice chair for the National Peace Action and president of the New York State Peace Action. And Vincent Intondi from the North Side, who's currently a professor at the Montgomery College in Tacoma, Maryland, and the author of African Americans Against the Bomb. And what Vince has reminded me to do, now I got to go to YouTube and find the Riverside Church speech. And there's the book, African Americans Against the Bomb. Vincent has a lot of steep history that he's certainly encouraged us to think about. Look, I had no idea, for real, that this was even an issue to even be thinking about, talking about. So thank you all for the work that you're doing in raising awareness, and certainly Syracuse Peace Council website, Peace Action of New York, and Peace Action National. And also check out Vince's book. You can find that on Amazon, I'm sure. All right. Inspiration for the Nation, Diane, Jim, and Dr. Vincent Intondi, thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you. To be continued.
To be continued.